At 9:17 a.m., the city still believed it was safe. Coffee was still warm, traffic lights still changed on time, and nobody knew that destiny had already pulled the trigger. What started as a cold winter morning would become 44 minutes of urban war, greed, blood, and survival. Two men chasing luxury, fame, gold, and an empire they thought they deserved. Dozens of officers answering a call they didn't choose but couldn't ignore. Automatic gunfire echoing through streets that had only known routine. And somewhere between ambition and justice, the illusion of invincibility would collapse. This isn't just a story about a bank robbery. It's about what happens when greed convinces you that shortcuts lead to power. It's about the psychology of ambition when it loses its moral compass. It's about fear meeting courage face to face. About brotherhood under fire. About how fame can turn from dream to warning in seconds. And about the price that chaos always demands. You're going to feel the tension build. You're going to see how luxury fantasies transformed into smoke and shattered glass. You'll understand why survival becomes louder than ego when bullets start flying. And most importantly, you'll see how justice doesn't rush, it endures. Because every empire built on greed carries an Achilles heel. And when destiny decides it's time, even the loudest beast falls. But not before leaving scars that a city will never forget. Stay with me until the end, because what really matters isn't just how the gunfire stopped. It's what this morning revealed about ambition, power, and the thin line between confidence and collapse. If stories like this, intense, real, and deeper than headlines, move you, make sure you hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because some songs aren't just music. They're warnings disguised as rhythm. And today, we just stepped into one of the loudest. He always said winter mornings felt honest, like the cold didn't bother pretending to be kind. A little past 9 a.m., the city looked clean on the surface. Quiet streets, polite traffic, folks clutching coffee like it was armor. But inside that calm, two men sat with ambition humming in their veins, the kind that doesn't let you breathe normally. They'd tasted luxury before, gold, diamonds, a borrowed kind of fame, and it ruined regular life for them. When you've seen wealth sparkle under nightclub lights, a normal paycheck starts feeling like an insult. And that's where destiny gets sneaky, because it doesn't always arrive like thunder. It slips in like a thought you shouldn't entertain. This morning, that thought was simple. Today we finally take the world's wallet and make it call us, sir. The plan had a perfect car, the kind of ride that screams status without saying a word. A glossy machine, leather seats, tinted windows, an instant prestige flex, like fortune could be parked at the curb. But the car didn't show, and you'd think a smart man would take that as a sign and go home. They didn't, because greed doesn't respect signs. Greed respects only speed, pressure, and ego. One of them laughed like it was a joke. The other clenched his jaw like he was swallowing a lifetime of regret in advance. They had bills, grudges, and a hunger for an empire, and hunger makes excuses sound like logic. So they looked at each other and made the dumbest decision that always feels brilliant in the moment. Fine, we'll take the bank. They weren't thinking about people, not really, just numbers, cameras, and the sweet sting of, we did it. In their minds, it wasn't a robbery, it was a shortcut to legacy, a speed run to power and fame. They pictured headlines, whispered stories, the kind of myth that grows bigger every time someone retells it. They imagined diamonds on wrists, gold chains catching light, and luxury turning pain into a distant memory. And deep down, there was fear too, because only a scared person needs to prove he's untouchable. That's the ugly secret. The loudest confidence is often just fear wearing expensive cologne. Still, they kept feeding that monster inside, the one that says more, more, more until it eats everything. They checked the time like it mattered, like a clock could negotiate with destiny. One said, "We're good," but his voice didn't sound good, it sounded like someone trying to talk himself off a ledge. The other one talked about the future the way people talk about heaven. Shiny, guaranteed, and definitely deserved. He spoke of wealth like it was justice, like money would finally make the world apologize for what it did to them. He called it redemption, but it wasn't redemption, it was revenge with a price tag. And when he smiled, it wasn't joy, it was that dangerous kind of hope that makes you ignore consequences. Because the truth is, ambition without a soul turns you into a traveler with no brakes. Outside, the bank looked ordinary, like it had never seen a bad day in its life. A couple of people walked in with documents, maybe dreams, maybe problems they thought money could solve. No one could smell the chaos coming, and that's how chaos wins. It arrives disguised as just another morning. The two men watched the doors like predators, but not the cartoon kind, more like wounded animals with sharp teeth. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as survivors, and survival stories can get twisted fast. They believed justice owed them something, and that belief can be more dangerous than any weapon. So they stepped into the day like it was theirs, like the city was a stage built to witness their legacy. Here's the part most people skip, but it matters. The moment right before the storm is where your character gets decided. A good man, in that same moment, would hear his own heart and back away. He'd choose courage over ego. But these two, they chose the thrill, the flex, the illusion of control, like fortune was a switch they could flip. They didn't know they were walking toward war, not the kind with flags, but the kind with sirens and shattered glass. They thought they were chasing fame, but they were really inviting a lifetime of regret to sit beside them. And the city, sweet, distracted city, kept moving, not realizing it was seconds away from holding its breath. Because somewhere, just out of sight, a radio was about to crackle, and blood was about to start writing the next chapter. He'd later swear the air changed first, like the morning itself got nervous. A car horn sounded too sharp, a door closed too hard, and suddenly everything felt slightly louder than it should. That's what fear does. It turns details into warnings, even when you don't know what you're afraid of yet. Inside the bank, routine was still pretending to be safe, still smiling like it had never met violence. Outside, the two men held onto their fantasy of power and prestige, not noticing the cost piling up behind them. And somewhere down the street, officers were just starting their day, thinking it'd be paperwork, complaints, and coffee breath. Then the first urgent call cut through the calm, shots fired, and the city's winter morning finally lost its innocence. The radio didn't just crackle, it screamed, and anyone who has ever worn a badge knows that tone. "Shots fired at Bank of America," the dispatcher said, voice tight, like even the wires felt the chaos rising. In seconds, routine dissolved, coffee cups abandoned, engines roaring to life with a kind of mechanical urgency. This wasn't paperwork, wasn't a domestic call, wasn't a misunderstanding, it was war, urban and unapologetic. Officers drove toward the noise not because they were fearless, but because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's movement despite it. And while the two men chased wealth, fame, and fortune, others were about to chase something far more fragile: survival. That's the twist of destiny, two paths colliding at full speed, neither willing to blink first. Inside the bank, glass shattered like cheap promises, alarms screaming louder than any human voice could. Customers dropped to the floor, hands over heads, realizing that luxury and gold mean nothing when blood is a possibility. One of the gunmen moved with rehearsed precision, armored like he expected resistance. Breathing like this was a performance. To him, this was the doorway to power, to status, to a kind of prestige you can't buy politely. But outside, patrol cars screeched into position, doors flying open, officers crouching behind metal that suddenly felt thin. Standard-issue weapons in hand, they quickly understood something chilling: they were outgunned. And when you realize you brought a pocketknife to a battlefield of rifles, your heartbeat gets very honest. Automatic gunfire ripped through the morning like it was tearing the sky open. Bullets punched through patrol cars, engines smoked, windshields exploded into glittering fragments of false security. One officer fell, and in that moment, justice stopped being theoretical, it became personal. You see, brotherhood in uniform isn't poetic, it's practical. You move because someone beside you might not get another last breath. Hot blood met cold asphalt, and suddenly the cost of someone else's greed was painfully visible. The two gunmen weren't thinking about faces anymore. They were thinking about angles, reload times, dominance. But dominance built on ambition without restraint always forgets one thing: every action echoes. 4:44 minutes, the city didn't breathe normally. News helicopters circled, cameras capturing what the gunmen thought would be their rise to fame, now turning into spectacle. The irony. They wanted to be legendary, and they were getting their wish, but not the version they imagined. Instead of empire, they were building infamy. Instead of legacy, they were scripting their own collapse. Police pinned down behind vehicles felt the sting of fear, yes, but also something deeper: responsibility. Responsibility to strangers hiding inside, to partners bleeding outside, to a city that didn't choose this war. And sometimes responsibility is heavier than any armor. SWAT was called, because standard response wasn't enough anymore. This wasn't a routine robbery, it was an assault wrapped in arrogance and plated in steel. The gunmen had prepared for battle like they were storming history itself, stocked with armor-piercing rounds and ego. They believed preparation guaranteed control, that control guaranteed power, and power guaranteed fortune. But here's something life teaches the hard way: control is temporary, and chaos doesn't sign contracts. SWAT mobilized with discipline, not bravado, because real courage doesn't need to shout. And the street that once held polite traffic now held something closer to a battlefield overseas. An officer later said the sound was what he'd never forget, not the sight, but the sound. Metal screaming, concrete cracking, the uneven rhythm of automatic fire like a heart having a seizure. He admitted he felt fear, the kind that makes your mouth dry and your thoughts sharp. But he also felt something else, sacrifice settling into his bones, like he'd already made peace with the worst outcome. That's what separates ego from duty. Ego chases fame, duty accepts the possibility of a last breath. Meanwhile, inside their armored illusion, the two men kept firing, convinced they were untouchable beasts. They didn't yet see the flaw forming in their so-called invincibility. Because every beast has an Achilles heel, even if it's hidden under layers of steel and swagger. A weapon jams, a magazine runs low, stamina fades, survival has limits when fueled by adrenaline alone. The gunmen were burning energy fast, and adrenaline doesn't refill like a bank account. They were baptized in this firefight, yes, but baptism isn't always cleansing, sometimes it's exposure. The longer the battle stretched, the clearer it became, this wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about endurance, about whether greed could outlast organized justice. And just beyond the smoke, SWAT was taking position, waiting for the moment when the beast would finally blink. There's a moment in every war when the noise becomes background and instinct takes over. Officers pressed against asphalt, behind shredded patrol cars, realized this wasn't about tactics anymore, it was about survival. Bullets kept slicing through metal like it was cardboard, reminding everyone just how fragile protection really is. The two gunmen, wrapped in armor and ego, moved like they believed destiny had signed their names in permanent ink. They had chased wealth, fame, and fortune, but now they were chasing oxygen and reload timing. And somewhere between gunfire bursts, the illusion of luxury and prestige felt laughably distant. Because when death is close enough to smell, no one brags about diamonds. One officer later admitted he thought about his daughter's last school recital. Not about medals, not about promotions, just about whether he'd get another ordinary Tuesday. That's the quiet truth of courage. It doesn't roar, it whispers, hold the line. His partner dragged him behind thicker cover, bullets snapping past like angry hornets fueled by chaos. That drag wasn't just instinct, it was brotherhood, the kind that doesn't need speeches. Hot blood mixed with cold fear, and yet no one ran. Because running would mean leaving someone behind, and that's a cost too heavy for men sworn to justice. Inside their armored confidence, the gunmen felt powerful, at least at first. Their automatic fire echoed like dominance, like they were kings carving out an empire in real time. They believed their preparation made them unstoppable, that armor-piercing rounds meant guaranteed power. But endurance isn't just about ammunition, it's about stamina, clarity, and discipline. And adrenaline, no matter how intense, burns fast when fed by ambition and greed. The longer they fired, the more their myth started cracking, hairline fractures under the surface. Because even beasts fueled by ego eventually start to feel their own heartbeat racing. SWAT units tightened the perimeter with calculated calm. No screaming, no panic, just precision, like chess players moving toward checkmate. They understood this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring balance, about reasserting justice over chaos. While the gunmen chased headlines and accidental fame, SWAT chased angles, weaknesses, and time. Time is a strange ally. It favors discipline over desperation. And desperation had started creeping into the gunmen's movements, subtle but visible. Every reload was a fraction slower, every step slightly heavier. At one point, one of the gunmen stepped into open view longer than planned. Not because he wanted to, but because fatigue doesn't ask permission. Armor protected much, but not everything. No armor can shield poor judgment forever. That's when officers saw it, the slight imbalance, the imperfect coverage, the first glimpse of an Achilles heel. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, like destiny blinking for half a second. And in battles like this, half a second is the difference between myth and mortality. The so-called beast had finally shown a seam in its steel. Meanwhile, helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the spectacle live. The irony was brutal. They had craved fame, and now millions were watching their unraveling. But this wasn't red carpet prestige. This was national shock, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. What they imagined as a gateway to legacy was morphing into permanent regret. Luxury dreams evaporated under sirens and smoke. Gold and diamonds couldn't buy rewinds, couldn't purchase erased footage. And every minute stretched longer than the last, draining illusion from reality. Pinned down yet unbroken, officers adjusted strategy. They weren't thinking about glory, they were thinking about ending it without more sacrifice. Fear was still present, yes, but so was resolve, steady and grounded. Because real power isn't in how loudly you fire, it's in how long you endure. The gunmen had initiated the war, but they were starting to lose control of its rhythm. And somewhere between exhaustion and arrogance, destiny was tightening its grip. The next move wouldn't just decide the fight, it would expose the cost of chasing an empire built on greed. If chaos has a sound, discipline has one too, and it's quieter. When SWAT arrived, the energy shifted, not louder, but sharper, like a blade being drawn slowly. This wasn't adrenaline anymore. This was calculation meeting ambition head-on. The gunmen still believed in their armor, their rifles, their illusion of unstoppable power. They had dressed for war like generals of a personal empire, convinced destiny favored boldness. But real force doesn't shout, it studies, waits, adapts, and then strikes with precision. And for the first time that morning, the balance between chaos and justice started to tilt. The street looked like a battlefield, shattered glass glittering like broken diamonds, smoke rising where patrol cars once stood. Luxury dreams had turned into debris, gold fantasies replaced by the metallic scent of blood in cold air. The men who chased wealth and fame now paced under sniper scopes they couldn't see. Their idea of prestige was crumbling under disciplined counter-movement. You see, greed burns fast, structure burns slow. The SWAT commander wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about angles, cover, and the next safe advance. Because courage isn't reckless, it's controlled pressure applied at the right second. Inside their armored illusion, fatigue began whispering doubts. Adrenaline had masked it for nearly 44 minutes, but bodies have limits even when ego doesn't. One gunman adjusted his weapon slightly slower than before, subtle but noticeable. And in high-stakes war, subtle becomes decisive. They had wanted to be remembered, to carve a legacy through spectacle and force. But legacy built on greed and chaos always forgets one thing: the system eventually responds. And when the system responds with unity and strategy, even the loudest aggression begins to crack. SWAT's movements were almost surgical. AR-15 optics locked in, communication crisp, positions tightening like a closing fist. This wasn't about domination, it was about ending the threat with minimal sacrifice. Meanwhile, the gunmen kept firing bursts that grew more erratic, powerful, but less precise. Their initial aura of invincibility began to thin, like smoke dispersing in winter wind. They had chased fortune, but fortune doesn't stay loyal to desperation. And the street that once belonged to them now felt smaller, narrower, less forgiving. One officer spotted it, the imperfect angle in the armor, the gap that arrogance had overlooked. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just human vulnerability exposed under pressure. That was the Achilles heel, not just physical, but psychological. Confidence turned to urgency, urgency to subtle panic. And panic is loud, even when no one speaks. The beast wasn't roaring anymore, it was reacting. And when the beast reacts instead of controls, its range shortens fast. Helicopters above kept broadcasting every second to a stunned nation. The fame they once imagined as glamorous now played out as cautionary footage. Their pursuit of status and wealth had become a public unraveling. Millions were watching ambition collide with reality. This was no longer a robbery, it was a lesson in the cost of unrestrained desire. And deep down, even the gunmen could feel it shifting, the narrative escaping their grip. Because control is intoxicating, until it evaporates. SWAT tightened the perimeter one final degree. Breathing synchronized, communication clean, patience weaponized. Justice wasn't rushing, it was closing in with quiet inevitability. The gunmen, once bold architects of a violent empire, now stood inside their own narrowing circle. Their luxury dreams, their hunger for power and prestige, felt distant, almost absurd. All that remained was survival, stripped of glamour, stripped of ego. And in the next few seconds, the illusion of the beast would finally meet the consequence of its own ambition. Every empire, no matter how armored, carries a fracture somewhere beneath the shine. It might be ego, fatigue, overconfidence, or simply time working against you. For nearly 44 minutes, the gunmen had moved like titans of chaos, fueled by ambition and wrapped in steel. They believed their preparation made them invincible, that power and prestige could be manufactured through violence. But here's the thing about destiny, it doesn't rush, it waits for the smallest miscalculation. And miscalculation always shows up when adrenaline begins to thin. That morning, destiny wasn't loud. It was patient. One of the gunmen adjusted his stance, favoring a leg slightly more than before. Not dramatic enough for headlines, but obvious to trained eyes watching from a distance. Armor covered most of him, but not everything. Protection is never absolute. In chasing wealth and fame, he had forgotten that even gold-plated confidence has limits. He had imagined building a legacy through force, carving an empire in gunfire. Instead, exhaustion began chiseling away at the myth he'd built around himself. And myths don't survive when reality presses close enough. Swat recognized the pattern: slower pivots, heavier breathing, widening exposure. Real force doesn't gamble, it calculates when the window is open. They weren't thinking about revenge, only containment, only minimizing sacrifice. Because real courage isn't reckless, it's disciplined restraint under pressure. The gunmen had initiated war, but they were no longer controlling its rhythm. Their ambition had lit the fire, yet now they were burning inside it. And when greed ignites chaos, chaos eventually consumes its architect. The first decisive shot didn't feel cinematic, it felt inevitable. The so-called beast staggered, armor absorbing much but not enough. The illusion of invincibility shattered faster than the glass that morning. Hot blood met cold pavement again, this time rewriting the balance of power. The man who had chased fortune and prestige through violence now struggled simply to stand. Ambition drained from his face, replaced by something raw and human: fear. Because in the end, survival humbles even the loudest ego. The second gunman kept firing, but desperation has a different rhythm. His bursts lacked precision, driven more by panic than strategy. The empire he imagined crumbled into instinctive reaction. No more thoughts of diamonds, no more fantasies of luxury. Only noise, breath, and the sudden awareness that control had vanished. He had wanted fame, and cameras still rolled, but not as celebration. This was not the legacy he envisioned, this was collapse unfolding live. As officers advanced carefully, there was no cheering, no victory dance. Only tension easing slowly, like a storm finally passing. Justice had not arrived dramatically, it had endured patiently. Brotherhood held the line, survival outlasted chaos. The beast that once roared now lay defeated by its own overreach. And in that silence after gunfire, the city felt something strange, not triumph, but sobering clarity. Because the cost of greed had been paid in blood and fear. Helicopters continued circling, broadcasting the final moments of an empire that never truly existed. The gunmen had chased wealth, status, power, but found consequence instead. Their ambition had written a story they could not revise. And the city, wounded but standing, would carry the lesson long after headlines faded. Luxury fades, fame distorts, greed devours. But discipline, courage, and unity endure. And as the smoke cleared, the deeper cost of that winter morning was only beginning to surface. When the gunfire stopped, the silence felt heavier than the noise ever did. Smoke lingered over the street like a reminder that war had visited without permission. The two men who chased wealth, fame, and prestige now lay inside the wreckage of their own ambition. No red carpets, no empire, no gold-plated future, just consequences cooling in winter air. They had wanted to be remembered, and now they would be, but not the way ego imagines. Because fame doesn't care whether it crowns you or exposes you. And that morning, it exposed everything. News anchors replayed the footage endlessly, analyzing every second of chaos. Commentators debated tactics, armor, weaponry, response times, but the real story ran deeper. This wasn't just about guns, it was about greed dressed up as destiny. It was about how the pursuit of luxury and fortune can slowly distort your sense of justice. When ambition loses its moral anchor, it doesn't build legacy, it builds wreckage. The city watched, shaken, realizing how thin the line is between routine and catastrophe. And somewhere in living rooms across the nation, people whispered the same question, why? Officers visited hospitals, checked on the wounded, replayed the event in their minds. Brotherhood doesn't dissolve when the sirens fade, it tightens. They thought about the moments of fear, about how close survival had felt to slipping away. They didn't talk about medals, they talked about breath, about that fragile thing called a last breath. Because when you've stared at chaos long enough, you stop chasing prestige and start valuing presence. Justice, in the end, isn't glamorous, it's costly. And sacrifice leaves marks no headline ever shows. The gunmen had believed money could rewrite their story. They imagined diamonds, penthouses, status symbols flashing under neon lights. They mistook power for control and control for immortality. But immortality doesn't come from force, it comes from meaning. An empire built on fear collapses the moment fear shifts direction. Their legacy wasn't gold, it was a cautionary tale etched into city memory. And regret, if it could speak, would have sounded louder than gunfire. Policy discussions followed, tactical upgrades debated, training enhanced. The system adapted because that's what systems do after impact. But the deeper conversation was cultural, about ambition, about desperation, about the illusion of shortcuts. In a world obsessed with instant wealth and visible status, patience feels outdated. Yet that morning proved something uncomfortable. Shortcuts often cut deeper than expected. Luxury without integrity corrodes from the inside out. And destiny, despite what ego believes, doesn't reward chaos forever. Families of officers held them tighter that night. Small things, dinner at the table, laughter in the living room, felt expensive in a way money can't measure. The contrast was brutal. One group chased fortune and lost everything, another defended strangers and kept breathing. That's the paradox of courage. It rarely seeks fame, but it earns respect. Fear had been real, but so had resolve. Blood had been spilled, but unity had endured. And somewhere in that emotional aftermath, a deeper shift began forming. Because beyond headlines and tactical reviews, something changed in the city's heartbeat. People saw how fast ambition can mutate into destruction. They saw how greed, when unchecked, writes tragedy instead of triumph. But they also saw courage under pressure, discipline under fire, brotherhood refusing to fracture. And while the empire of violence had fallen, something steadier had risen in its place. A reminder that true power isn't in taking, it's in protecting. And that realization was about to reshape how this story would be remembered. Redemption doesn't always look holy. Sometimes it looks exhausted and covered in dust. When the sirens faded and the helicopters drifted away, the city stood in a strange stillness. Not victorious, not untouched, but awake. The empire of greed that tried to rise that morning had collapsed under its own arrogance. Luxury dreams dissolved into court records and archived footage. Fame had arrived, yes, but it carried no glamour, only warning. And in that warning, a different kind of legacy began to form. The officers who held the line didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men who did what had to be done despite fear clawing at their ribs. Courage isn't loud, it's stubborn. Brotherhood isn't poetic, it's practical, it's dragging someone behind cover without hesitation. Justice isn't cinematic, it's disciplined endurance when chaos tries to take control. They had faced automatic fire with standard tools and unshaken resolve. And survival, that day, became louder than any weapon fired. The gunmen had believed power meant domination. They thought wealth and prestige would silence the insecurities that pushed them forward. But power without purpose fractures under pressure. Ambition without integrity corrodes from the inside. They chased fortune as if it were redemption, but redemption can't be stolen. They sought status through violence, but violence only magnifies emptiness. And in the end, the beast fell not because it was weak, but because it was hollow. The city learned something uncomfortable that winter morning. Security is not permanent, peace is not guaranteed. But unity can be stronger than chaos when it refuses to panic. Policies changed, training evolved, systems strengthened. Not out of vengeance, but out of responsibility. Because real power isn't reactive, it adapts. And adaptation is a quiet form of justice. Families hugged longer that night. Simple dinners felt like luxury. Breathing felt expensive. The illusion that fame and gold defined success lost its shine. People saw clearly how greed writes its own downfall. And they also saw how courage writes something far more enduring. Blood had been spilled, but so had resolve. In the weeks that followed, the headlines shifted. The spectacle faded, replaced by reflection. The so-called empire of violence became a case study in overreach. The officer's restraint became a model of controlled force. Destiny had collided with ambition, and destiny outlasted it. Survival had trumped spectacle. And the city carried forward, scarred but steadier. Because redemption, when it comes, isn't about the fallen, it's about the living. It's about choosing discipline over ego, patience over shortcuts. It's about understanding that legacy is built through protection, not intimidation. The pursuit of luxury without conscience leads to ruin. The pursuit of justice with courage leads to stability. And in that contrast, the true moral of the morning finally emerged. Not as a shout, but as a steady truth. Power without integrity always falls. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. At what point do you think it stopped being about wealth and luxury, and started being about ego? Was it when the car didn't show up? Was it when the first shot was fired? Or was it much earlier, the moment greed convinced them they deserved an empire without earning it? Because that's the real battlefield, not the street, but the mind. And that's where destiny quietly waits. We talk about power like it's glamorous. We glorify fame, prestige, status, diamonds, gold. But today you saw what happens when ambition loses discipline. You saw how chaos grows when shortcuts replace integrity. You saw how survival becomes the only currency that matters when blood hits asphalt. And maybe, just maybe, you realized something about your own definition of success. That's the kind of reflection most people skip, but not you. So tell me in the comments, do you believe they were driven more by desperation or by pride? At what moment did their empire truly collapse? And if you were writing this story, what would you change? I read every comment, and your perspective might shape the next story we build here. Drop the name of a song you'd like me to transform into a powerful narrative. Let's turn music into meaning together. If this story pulled you in, if you felt the tension, the fear, the courage, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we're not just telling stories here. We're dissecting ambition, exposing greed, and revealing the thin line between power and downfall. And the next song we break down might hit even closer to home. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.